Erev Shabbos, there's a clever line mentioned in a number of scholarly Jewish works concerning the very first letter of the Torah. For more than a millennium and a half of Jewish history, rabbis have puzzled over why the Torah starts with the letter Bet, the second letter in the Hebrew alphabet. Why does the Torah not just start with the first letter, with an aleph? Why not find a clever way to start with an aleph instead? In fact, the same question can be asked about the Talmud. Each tractate of the Talmud begins with page Bet rather than with page Aleph, with Daf Aleph. Why? Why does the Gemara start with Daf Bet, not Daf Aleph? The answer many give is to remind you that you don't really even know Aleph. You don't understand the first thing about Torah. So when you're starting to learn Torah, you should be humble. You don't even understand the first thing. Now, as dispiriting as that answer may initially sound, in the context of the Torah reading tomorrow, it's entirely reasonable. Rabbi Yehuda Amital, the late Rosh Hashiva of Yeshiva Har Etzion in Gush, famously once told his students, "Big bang, small bang, I don't understand anything in Parshat Bereisheet. Big bang, small bang, ani lo mevin klum, the Parshat Bereisheet. I don't understand anything in Parshat Bereisheet." Now, obviously, Rabbi Amital did not mean to say that he couldn't read and interpret the words of the Parsha. What Rabbi Amital was expressing was his frustration at this Parsha of Bereisheet is uniquely challenging to understand in terms of its moral lessons, its theological meaning, and how it fits with the scientific data for how the physical universe as we know it was formed. Understanding the story of God's creation of the universe is so important, and yet it is filled with so many mysterious lines and objectively strange stories. The many, many different interpretations of these stories by rabbinic commentators only further exacerbates the challenge of understanding it. And so perhaps it's not unreasonable, at least with respect to this parsha, to say that we don't even understand Aleph. We don't understand the first thing about it. But there are other explanations for why the Torah starts with the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet rather than with the first, with Aleph. Midrash in Bereisheet Rabbah suggests that maybe the shape of the letter Bet is what is important. Since Hebrew is read from right to left, the Bet at the beginning of the Torah looks a lot like a bracket, which indicates a separation between what is to the left of the Bet and what comes before it. Only the left side of the Bet is open, while all other sides of the Bet are closed off. Says the Midrash that teaches us that with respect to the Torah, we may not ask what came before creation. We can only focus on what happens afterward. Alternatively, the Midrash, the letter Aleph is the first letter of the word Aribah, which has to do with cursing, while the letter Bet is the first letter of the word Bracha, blessing. The Ribono Shel Olam, the master of the universe, ensured history would start with divine blessing and not a curse. And that is why it starts with Bereisheet, with a Bet, and not with an Aleph. The late Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson Zatzal, makes another suggestion. He says that before we can begin to read the Torah, there is a prerequisite that we first need to fulfill. The Torah is not like other works of literature where we can read it as something we may choose to agree or disagree with. It is not a book of stories to entertain us, where we can evaluate the Torah's plot and its characters and decide whether it's well written and of interest to us. We need to first focus on Hashem to realize that when we're about to learn Torah, we're about to read God's words to us. We need to accept and absorb the concept of Aleph, of Hashem Echad, of oneness, of God being the one, the only God, before we begin learning. Assigning Torah study, this two-step process accomplishes two goals. First of all, by focusing on Hashem and our relationship with Him before we begin learning, it puts us in the proper mindset for how we should think about the Torah. It helps remind us that we are studying holy texts, engaged in a spiritual pursuit, and not simply an intellectual exercise. And second, by first thinking about Hashem and then learning the Torah, it frees us to focus on the substance of the Torah while we're learning. It's impossible to think about spirituality in depth at the same time that we're breaking our teeth on a difficult Gemara or interpreting a challenging series of verses in Tanakh. Rabbi Shalom Rosner adds that this concept of a prerequisite to learning Torah is found elsewhere in rabbinic literature. He points out that the Gemara Nida says that the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed because the Jewish people failed to regularly say Birkat HaTorah, to say the blessing that is recited before studying Torah each morning. And he explains that this is because the purpose of the bracha of Birkat HaTorah is to be the aleph before the bet of the Torah, to fulfill the prerequisite of focusing on Hashem and our relationship with Him before we begin to engage with the actual texts of Hashem's Torah. Furthermore, Rabbi Rosner notes that Maimonides criticizes the Bahag for leaving out the mitzvah of knowing Hashem from his list of 613 commandments. Ramban explains that perhaps knowledge of God is a prerequisite to the mitzvah. It is prior to the invisible aleph, and that is why it is not among the 613 commandments of the Bahag, because it's not one of the mitzvot. It's so fundamental that it's not part of the Torah, but rather it is the stuff that underlies it. But there's one more explanation of why the Torah starts with bet that is less well known. I once heard the following story from my teacher, Rabbi Yisrael Kamenetsky, about the first Satmar Rebbe, Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum. Satmar Rebbe was a survivor of the Holocaust, and much of his community, as well as a large portion of Hungarian Jewry, was wiped out by the Nazis. When he immigrated to the United States in 1946, the Satmar Rebbe came with a small group of supporters. The Satmar community was tiny and made up mostly of survivors. At some point shortly after his arrival in New York, he announced he would be delivering a Gemara shir for anyone who wanted to attend. And on the day that the shir was meant to start, men filed into the room with the Gemaras, and everyone prepared themselves for serious learning from a great Torah scholar. But the Satmar Rebbe did not open his Gemara. Instead, he looked at one of the men sitting before him and started to inquire about the man's personal story. The Rebbe asked him where he was from, what happened to him during the war, what happened to his family, how did he get to the United States. And when he was finished, after 10 minutes or so with the first man, he then moved on to the man next to him and asked him similarly detailed questions. Each conversation lasted quite a while, and the time allotted for the shir was over before he even finished interviewing half of the attendees. This pattern of the Satmar Rebbe asking each man in this Gemara shir about his story continued for several sessions, several shiurim, before the attendees got up the courage to ask the Rebbe what was going on. Rebbe, they said, we're hoping to learn Gemara from you. Why is the Rebbe spending so much time instead talking to each of us about our stories? What page does the tractate of Gemara start on? The Rebbe retorted. The Rebbe asked, what page does a Masachet of Gemara start on? And of course, they all answered on Daf Bet. Starts on page Bet. And the Rebbe said, yes. And knowing the people with whom you are learning Torah, asking these questions, having these conversations, that's Daf Aleph. That's page Aleph. That's the first page. In other words, perhaps the Torah starts with the letter Bet, and the Gemara starts with page Bet, Daf Bet, to remind us that we cannot learn Torah while ignoring the social context. The people in our lives are engaging in that study of Torah with us. Teachers must know their students. Study partners must get to know each other. Torah study can be done alone, but it is primarily a group effort, perhaps even a national project. And we cannot be successful in studying the text on the page unless we first learn Daf Aleph, page 1, which is written not on paper, but in the minds and hearts of our fellow human beings. The first thing we need to do before we can learn Gemara with somebody is to have empathy. Before we can study Torah, we need empathy. We need ethics. We need menschlichkeit. The Midrash teaches that derech eretz kadma laTorah, that the way of the world preceded the Torah by 26 generations. And Derech Eretz is generally understood in this context to be referring to menschlichkeit, ethical and decent behavior, and the rabbis are saying that the rules of such behavior were historically developed at creation 26 generations before the giving of the Torah. Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, however, points out that the Maharal understands this phrase of Derech Eretz Kadmon LaTorah as also referring to logical prioritizing, that ethical behavior is the foundation upon which Torah observance is built. It is the aleph that must be learned before you can read the bet of Bereisheet in the text of the Torah. You need Derech Eretz before you can learn Torah properly. And recently, we've seen Orthodox Jews engage in violent protests and even some racist and sexist behavior in the context of opposing COVID restrictions in New York. One journalist was physically beaten, another had racist and homophobic slurs shouted at them, and a third was sexually harassed as she attempted to interview the leader of the protest. Protesters burned masks, fought with police, and coined the phrase Jewish Lives Matter, even though the only threat to Jewish lives was in the maskless mass gatherings taking place in the community, not from the government. The justification of the protests is that these restrictions that the government put on them affect religious observance, affect our ability to fulfill the commandments of the Torah properly and to celebrate on this past Simchat Torah. It is thus important to emphasize, once again, that before we can read Bereisheet, before we can learn Torah, before we can celebrate the Torah, before we can engage with the Torah's text and content, before we begin with bet, there's a prerequisite of aleph. Not only must we focus on our relationship with Hashem, but also on Derech Eretz, on the human beings in our lives that are affected by the Torah, on the ethics, the menschlichkeit. We need to first master menschlichkeit. Only then can we turn to bet and begin learning and applying the Torah. May we take this lesson to heart and serve as a source of only Kiddush Hashem, sanctification of God's name in the future. I want to wish you a safe and enjoyable Shabbat.